Amen.
Please pray with me. Loving God, it isn't always easy to find hope and peace in your world, sometimes even in your word. But we know that it's there for us, and I pray that I've found the message of peace in your word for us tonight, and that it brings hope and peace to the hearts of those who listen. Amen.
Amen.
I've not been to the wildernesses of Israel and Judah myself, but I know those who have, and I've seen the pictures, did a lot of research, and they are not an easy place to travel. I thought the Scottish Highlands were pretty tough as walking trips went, but Israel's something else again. Quite apart from the thieves and the wild animals that come into the tales of, like the parable of the Good Samaritan, it's this hard, rocky jumble of high peaks and steep drop-offs, parts of it that are massively below sea level, and others which are great mountains. The distance between the River Jordan and the Dead Sea and Jerusalem is huge in height. It's a tough place. The roads are rough indeed. It's dusty, hot and dry for much of the year, and inclined to flash flooding in some of the rest. The prophet knew what he was talking about when he spoke about mountains and valleys and winding ways. Both Isaiah and John the Baptist had travelled there, struggling up the steep inclines, stumbling over the loose stones, grateful for the occasional bit of shade, wary of the dangerous cliffs and caves and ravines. And they found there a picture of the human race's weary journey, searching for peace and hope. And how often have we trudged, human beings, thirsty, wary, weary, looking for hope, looking for peace, looking for comfort. I've known so many people, in church and out of it, souls in the wilderness, a long, tiring road that never seems to get anywhere. I've been there. And at times when I was there, I felt God was simply unreachable. That for someone like me, God couldn't be reached. I wasn't equipped. I wasn't up to the hardness of the road. And Isaiah's people and John's people felt the same. Lost, grieving, lonely, afraid. I like it when we follow the narrative of the Bible at times like Christmas. We travel along with Jesus and his disciples, or along with God's people Israel, from Egypt to Canaan, and then from Israel into exile and back again. We don't just hear the story, we get to reenact it at times like Christmas. We get to be in it, re-experience it. There's a fancy scholar's name for it, they call it anamnesis. It's the kind of remembering a community does, where you don't just remember, you bring the past into the present, you make it come alive again. It becomes our story. And we see our own stories in it, part of it. We remember that we're part of the relationship between God and God's beloved world. And so in Advent, the bit of the story we step into is the waiting. Because the history of God's people has hardly been all uninterrupted joy and fruitfulness and fulfillment and excitement. Most of it was spent not knowing how or even if God was going to fulfill God's promises. Much more time in tears than in triumph. They began a single nomadic couple who waited almost their whole lives to see the promise of a son fulfilled, and even then had to take it on trust that this one boy would be the seed of a whole people. Not long after that, the people became slaves in Egypt. And after their rescue, they were forged into a nation by 40 years of wandering in the wilderness. And no sooner had they become a settled nation, it seems, they start splitting apart again. First amongst themselves, and then constantly fighting for their identity between bigger and more powerful empires surrounding them. And it ended with exile and a long, long wait to return to their own land. And that was when Isaiah was writing to them. They'd been promised a Messiah would come, but a long wait was still ahead of them. And he saw their struggles and their confusion about who they were, whether they were still God's people, their despair as they tried to make sense of their lives without the old certainties. And he used that familiar image of the bleak hills and ravines, the uninhabited and unfarmable highlands that they would have had to travel through to get between the fertile plains and valleys. It became a metaphor for their doubt and their lostness, the peace they hadn't found, and their hunger to be God's chosen nation again, and to know that God was with them. But Isaiah saw more than the desert, more than the wilderness. He saw someone out there calling, prepare a way for the Lord. Not a way to the Lord, but a way for the Lord. God was coming to us. And that's why the passage begins with words, console my people. Console them. Or, in the words of the King James Version, comfort ye, my people. Christmas may be many things. Mystery, children's story, tradition, wonder, subversive justice message, a symbol of new light and hope, a lot of hard work, a time of awe and wonder. But for many of us, it isn't jolly. It isn't merry. It's hard work finding tidings of comfort and joy in a season that mainly reminds you of what you haven't got, or once had and lost. Maybe a time of being lonely, or cold and hungry, or grieving, or struggling to keep going. It may bring back memories of bad times, and it doesn't help when the rest of the world is throwing relentless happy at you, as though you ought to be enjoying the things you just don't have. We need Isaiah's promise. Console my people. Comfort them. If the wilderness is our image of our struggle to try and get close to God, to find, to understand, to break down the barrier that we feel divides us, then Isaiah makes it clear it is not us who crosses cliffs and mountains. It's God. The lostness is ours, but the finding is all God's. When John came crying in the desert, prepare a way, it was because he was heralding the arrival of God amongst us, not our imminent arrival with God. God breaks down the mountains, fills in the gulf between human and divine, in the most dramatic way by actually uniting God and humanity in Jesus. And what more could God have done to bring about Emmanuel, to bridge the gap, than to actually come and live life with us? That's a comfort, if anything is, that we aren't alone in this. That we don't have to beg or plead or bargain with God for crumbs of love or scraps of God's attention. God's already in it. already weeping with us, already wondering with us, hoping with us, fearing with us. Jesus did all those things and still does. And it's not earned, and it's not to be paid for, and we don't need to be a particular kind of person, or particularly good, or special, or holy. Thank goodness. It just is. All will see the salvation of God, Isaiah said. All. Not that that absolves us from all our responsibilities. We're to prepare a way not to get ourselves to God, but to make it easy for everyone to see God coming. If there's one thing that the church has tried but failed to do so many times over the centuries, it's this: to prepare a way so that all humanity will see the salvation of God. Whether it was the medieval church deciding that only those who could read and understand Latin had access to the words of comfort and peace and hope, or various places today deciding to deny communion and fellowship to those who are just a bit too different. The road between Jesus and Jesus' people sometimes seems as hard as it was for Israel thousands of years ago. Because Jesus is here now, but if you've been told your whole life that you need to change, or become perfect, or conform to someone else's ideals, or your own, before he will come to you, then how can you see? How can you see the salvation of God? We might not have intended to give a misleading impression of God's grace, but even when our words speak of free gifts, of God's profligate, ridiculously generous welcome, our actions can do the opposite. 1,000 unconscious attitudes or judgments. And looking back, I can see those times when people have directed me into the wilderness, told me all about the cliffs and ravines that were going to be there. It's harder to see when I did it myself. Where have I spoken or acted in such a way that someone thought God's not here? Or caused someone to doubt Jesus' good faith, or believe that the church had no place for them? As part of the preparation work for me, as part of the Advent work, am I not just saying, but living a life that prepares the way in that I'm not blocking the view for those who are looking for peace and for hope? That's why we keep praying, for God to help us, fill in those valleys that we keep trying to dig between us and a loving God who didn't want a valley there in the first place. To tear down those mountains we throw up, however accidentally, in front of those who are looking for hope. And that's why we enter into the waiting, the story. To feel for ourselves that longing, the long-held hope. So we never forget what it is we've been given. The story should never become old. The wonder of God's tender and gentle approach to us should never fade away. Because if it does, we might forget that as many still wait, longing to see that loving face approach, love is striding across the desert with arms wide open. We may forget that our task, the task that Jesus set us to complete, is simply to help others look and see that face, those arms, to experience that comfort and that wonder. Not to change them, not to judge them, not to choose their path for them. Jesus warned us plenty of times that those were not for us to do. Simply to point away and stop blocking the view. Do you remember the desert? What it felt like out there in the wilderness, when you thought the message of love was not for you. And what it felt like when you saw love coming across the mountains, levelling a straight road, a queer road, to come and pick you up and take you home. thank God by helping someone else to see it too. And if you're still out there, if this is shaping up to be anything but a Merry Christmas, if some days it's too hard to even pick up your feet and struggle on, then comfort you, my people, because God is coming to you. Amen.
Amen.